I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is Under the Dome. Another busy week in Alberta politics, from omnibus bills to birth control to children's Tylenol, and even what the Governor General thought of the Lieutenant Governor's comments on the Alberta Sovereignty Act. All that today on Under the Dome. My guest today, once again, Edmonton Journal political reporters Matthew Black, Lisa Johnson. Thanks again for joining me this week. It was a busy week in provincial politics, so much so that we couldn't possibly touch on everything that happened this week. We're going to touch on some big pieces of legislation, some moves by the NDP. So let's dive in. Let's get on the omnibus. There are two big pieces of legislation that the UCP government unveiled this week, and they were what you'd call omnibus bills. They're bills that kind of cover wide swaths of legislation. They touch on different ministries. And first, we're going to talk about Bill 9. And this is something that you covered, Matthew. This was touted as a red tape reduction bill, but it goes kind of far beyond that. It doesn't seem to revolve all around cutting red tape, does it?
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it here at the beginning. Maybe a good place to start is describing what an omnibus bill is, and that is one bill that affects multiple policy areas that are otherwise unrelated. And they can be a bit contentious because governments will say this is just an efficient way of tying up loose ends, of getting stuff done. While skeptics will say these kinds of bills are ways to backdoor things. It's really easy to sprinkle in a significant policy change that's going to get lost in the sauce. So Bill 9 was definitely one of those. Changes 14 bills across 9 ministries. And as you said, it's billed as the red tape reduction bill, but it also includes a host of other things. So it has an attempt to stiffen penalties for those subject to warrants by making them ineligible for government benefits. It changes how we refer to provincial court judges. They'll now be called Justice Smith, for instance, instead of Judge Smith. That'd be similar to how we refer to judges at the Court of Appeal or the Court of King's Bench. And that comes ahead of when we change the name of the provincial court to the Court of Justice on April 1st. There's a technical change to how the province will fund LRT projects in Calgary and Edmonton. There's updates to how irrigation districts are covered, and two more obscure items, updating regulations around bees and artwork insurance. Both things very much on the minds of Albertans, I'm sure. So it is a real odds and ends bill. Does it reduce red tape? Well, the government certainly thinks so. It likes to tout stats about its reduced red tape measures by X percent. Of course, there is no agreed to definition of red tape, and some are more hefty than others. And what is red tape to some is necessary regulation or due process to others. So it's a little less clear if this bill actually sets out what its title sets it out to do.
Mm-hmm. And I think the big piece in this legislation that a lot of people were curious about, or a lot of people interested in, was the changing to trespassing laws in Alberta that would essentially rope federal employees under these trespassing laws so they couldn't enter someone's property without permission. And I think this kind of ties into one of the big pieces of Danielle Smith's agenda, the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and people wonder whether this is the Sovereignty Act by backdoor, and also ties into something that's happened in Saskatchewan, where there's all sorts of controversy about Environment Canada employees, I believe, doing water quality measurements on people's land, and the landowners were upset because they didn't have permission. Like, why does the government feel that, A, they need to pass this one piece of this red tape reduction legislation, and what was their argument for it being necessary that it had to be done to begin with?
Yeah, I think you're right. If there was one big significant change in Bill 9, this was it. It certainly drew a lot of attention when it was first announced on the agenda last week. And to answer your question, what Service Alberta Minister Dale Nally told us is that it sets out to clarify, and that was his key word, clarify, that federal employees are subject to trespassing laws. Now, of course, there's no provision for employer in trespassing laws. They already apply universally to everyone, and many Crown employees have a legal right and indeed a duty to be on certain parts of land to fulfill their job. So we put that to Nally, why is any of this necessary? And he eventually admitted, look, there's nothing really new here, but he claims to have heard from Albertans that this clarification is necessary for them to protect their property rights. Others will say this is just a way for the province to poke Ottawa in the eye, kind of along the lines you were suggesting. But it's particularly poor timing given recent stories regarding a pair of pretty serious wastewater spills at the Curl site up in northern Alberta. Others say this is kind of putting a target on federal workers' backs and could in fact be dangerous if someone thinks that those workers are trespassing when they're in fact just doing their job. So there's definitely concern over the practical upshot of the rhetoric around this bill, and it seems to be doing more than just clarifying.
Now, Lisa, you looked at the next omnibus bill that the government was introduced this week. It was Bill 10. It's labeled as essentially a budget implementation bill, a fiscal statutes bill, but it has a host of line items in it as well. What was kind of the overarching purpose of the bill as outlined by Finance Minister Travis Toews when he unveiled it this week?
So Travis Toews painted it as, meeting the demands of all kinds of Albertans, municipalities, families, businesses that have asked for various things in legislation. And it's a total grab bag. Like Matthew outlining the previous bill, there's a lot going on here, and there are a lot of very niche issues. I don't think the majority of Albertans will notice or see a difference in their day-to-day lives because the horse racing legislation has been amended. Of course, it matters to people in the horse racing world. But the overarching purpose of this bill is to implement some of the promises that were made on budget day. And a few of those promises, we talked about last week, the fiscal framework that the government wants to bring into force. So a lot of this stuff is aimed at, projecting fiscal responsibility and showing that the government has very specific guardrails for how they spend a surplus or, keeping them from running into a deficit. This legislation, if it passes, would make it illegal for the government to run a deficit. But then, of course, the obvious point is that the government can change the law as they see fit. So, there are a couple of provisions there, right? Like if there's an emergency situation, if there's a crisis, if revenue drops by unexpectedly by $1 billion, well, of course you can run a deficit. So there are some get out of jail free cards there, but the main kind of purpose of it and something that we've come to expect from Travis Toews as well, who focuses on fiscal responsibility a lot, is trying to tie the government's hands in terms of future surpluses and budgets, and including this budget that we saw introduced on February 28th. So we've got the rule that 50% of a surplus has to go towards debt repayment. The other half has to go towards something they're calling the Alberta Fund. But then within the Alberta Fund, there are a few different things you can do with that money. And this is just what would normally be called general revenue surplus from the budget line. So it's kind of just that money under another name, with a few restrictions and provisos, right? So money in the Alberta Fund can go towards debt repayment. It can go towards the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, or it can go towards one-time project funding. And this is the thing that's kicked up a little bit of dust. Of course, the NDP has said that this is a pre-election slush fund. And yesterday, the finance critic, Shannon Phillips, was saying the fine print on the fund, of course, allows the UCP to spend that portion of the projected surplus for their re-election campaign before the bills come due at the end of the year, before the financial reporting, quarterly reports have to be done. So they can kind of be done behind closed doors. I've spoken with the finance minister about this, and he's promised that there will be no surprises when it comes to pre-election spending. But it is a thing to keep our eyes on, because of course the only bills remaining in this session that we've been promised by House Leader Joseph Scow are budget bills. We've got a couple of budget appropriation bills that will likely come next week. So if there is any pre-election spending, we've been told it will be outlined in those bills. The other main, I guess, kind of standout piece in this bill is that it outlines, and if it's passed, it will bring into force about $4 million in spending that the UCP has outlined in its budget for supporting adoption services and families who adopt children in Alberta. So
So what supports are they bringing into place for adoptive parents, and why did the government say that they felt this was an appropriate time, or why did they need to bring these measures in now?
So the government said it's focused on streamlining the process and making it more affordable for families who want to adopt to be able to adopt. because, of course, for some of them, the process can cost tens of thousands of dollars, especially if you're going through a private agency. So what the government wants to do with this bill is cover health coverage, supplemental health coverage for adopted children, dental benefits, drug prescription costs, vision costs, for anyone who's under 18 years old who's adopted in Alberta. And they also want to offer some kind of cash breaks. So there's a $6,000 subsidy, for example, that families would get to go towards those costs and kind of offset the overall cost of it. The other thing that I would add is that this is an issue that came up during the UCP leadership campaign last summer. And so you asked, why are they doing this now? It could tie into the fact that when UCP leadership candidates, including Travis Taves, who has identified himself as a pro-life, and Premier Danielle Smith, when they were asked about the issue of abortion, which was a bit of a topic last summer with the Roe v. Wade decision being overturned in the United States, when they were asked about it, they both referred to adoption services and really emphasized the importance of streamlining adoption services and making it easier for women to make the choice to put their children up for adoption, or for families to be able to adopt. This is an issue that covers a lot of their bases in a socially conservative party, if you will.
I mean, on that note, you raise an interesting point that, there's discussion around birth control, discussion around, reproductive rights, discussion around adoption. On that note, this week, the NDP on International Women's Day announced that they would be, if they form government, they would be essentially making contraception costs for women non-existent. They would cover the cost of like birth control pills, I assume IUDs. What did the NDP say when they introduced this? Why do they want to bring this in now? And what was kind of the reaction in the political sphere?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, they announced it on International Women's Day. That was Wednesday. And they basically took this policy, it's carbon copy from BC. So with BC's, British Columbia, the NDP government over there, with their most recent budget, they introduced this idea of covering all kinds of birth control. This goes from birth control pill to IUDs to implants. And essentially, they took that policy, did the math per capita, just add water. We promised to do this in Alberta. And it's a pretty significant policy, obviously, for women. You could call it a pocketbook pledge for women, because it will save a lot of women money, up to $500 a year for some costs, up to $10,000 over the course of someone's lifetime, the NDP estimated. So it'll save individuals money who need it, who don't have prescription coverage, for example, with a prescription plan. But you can also look at the long-term economic benefits of this. Economic benefits, social service cost benefits. I mean, this is essentially a long-term policy that could have, this is a policy that could have long-term implications for the healthcare system, for the social services system, and in general, the economy and women's participation in the economy. Mm-hmm. You also asked about what was the reaction to this. So when we put it to the UCP, well, what do you think about this policy? Health Minister Jason Copping said, essentially, there is a lot of coverage for women for birth control in Alberta. Alberta Health Services offers free contraceptives for some women, and there is coverage under, for example, Alberta Blue Cross. Of course, Alberta Blue Cross, you have to pay a monthly premium. So it's not universal free coverage, which is what the NDP is offering. And the Premier had some interesting things to say in question period about that particular issue as well.
So my question to the Premier is simple. Why is she so opposed to universal coverage for prescription contraception?
Yeah. The Honourable the Premier. sure why the members opposite are wanting to give a subsidy to private health insurance companies, because the vast majority of prescription drugs are covered under private plans. And so essentially having government step in and taxpayers step in would offer a subsidy to those insurance companies. We want to make sure that everybody has reasonable access to pharmaceuticals through a combination of private insurance and public insurance. They have access to the full range of drugs. We also have supports, of course, for our most vulnerable.
Now, it wasn't just all, omnibus bills and contraception. There was also something called budget estimate hearings in which, ministers answer questions about each department's budget. And one of the things that I think stood out for a lot of people was that during the health estimates, we got a bit more information about the big purchase of children's medication that the province undertook in the fall due to widespread shortages of things like children's Advil and children's Tylenol. Matthew, what did Jason Copping have to say about this purchase? How much did it ultimately end up costing the taxpayer?
Yeah, so cast your mind back to November, and if you're a parent like I am, around that time it was very difficult to find some pretty basic cold medication for kids among what was a pretty bad outbreak in a lot of areas. So the province decided to try and take matters into its own hands and order 5 million bottles of the stuff from a Turkish manufacturer with the idea that it would arrive within a few weeks. Of course, it turned out to be not quite as simple as that, and we're still waiting on the majority of those supplies, none of which are on store shelves yet, though the ones we have gotten are already been delivered to hospitals. So it came out this week during budget estimates, as you mentioned, that the project had an $80 million price tag, and the health minister, Jason Copping, defended that on a few fronts. He said, look, we're trying to alleviate a serious crisis, and some of these delays were simply beyond our control. We now have a stockpile of this medication, he said, for the next 3 years. And he pointed out the $80 million doesn't get into the revenue side of things that the government will get back by selling the drugs. The problem, though, is that for many of us, the pharmacy you went to in November that was sold out then is no longer sold out. There's also no big outbreak at the moment, so it's fair to say demand has declined significantly. And as the NDP pointed out yesterday, that the government paid a high price for this stuff, didn't get it on time, and is now stuck with it when it's not really needed or needed in that quantity. There's just under 800,000 kids in the province under the age of 14 who would need this stuff, and we're going to get 5 million bottles, so it's a bit of an oversupply. Now, Copping did say that a shipment of 250,000 bottles arrived last week. It's in quarantine right now and will be released to pharmacies next week, so we're expecting a government announcement on that to come.
And lastly, I did want to touch on, you had an interesting story, Matthew, this week. And again, we may be casting people's minds back to late last summer in the UCP leadership race, but we got some new information about, there was a debate at the time over Danielle Smith's proposed Alberta Sovereignty Act. And obviously they've introduced this act, they've passed it, they're not sure when they're going to implement it. But at the time, Alberta's Lieutenant Governor, Salma Lakhani, said, there's a chance that she could turn around and not give royal assent to it, which kind of caught everybody by surprise. And a lot of people, weren't sure that the lieutenant governor had that power. Ultimately, there's also the governor general in Canada who could eventually be asked to weigh in. And we got some information from her side of things. What did we learn about Governor General Mary Simon's response to what our lieutenant governor had to say?
Yeah, so again, you kind of set the scene nicely there. You got to cast your mind back to Alberta Day, the first Alberta Day last year, September the 1st. And at that time, Danielle Smith is not the premier. She's the front runner for the UCP leadership. Her signature policy is the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of bluster about what the Sovereignty Act would contain. Some suggesting it would involve things like ignoring court rulings and would be deliberately unconstitutional in a provocative sense. So given that, some of my colleagues thought that day to ask the Lieutenant Governor what her views were on the Act's constitutionality and possibly withholding royal assent or reserving the bill to the Governor General for further consideration. And her comments weren't terribly controversial on the face of it. It's surprising she spoke out at all in some level, as you pointed out, but she likened herself to a constitutional fire extinguisher, rarely needed, but ready to be used if need be. But also that she'd seek the advice on the act before signing it into law. And so last week, I got back an access to information request that included a briefing note for the clerk of the Privy Council. That's the top civil servant in Canada. And it was drafted ahead of a meeting a few weeks after those comments between the clerk and the Governor General, and outlines what they are going to talk about, which included Lacani's remarks. So we don't know what was actually discussed, but it appears that Governor General Mary Simon was a bit concerned about what Lacani was putting out there, specifically that Simon would be asked her opinion on those comments and what she would do if Lacani referred the bill back to her. Lacani also indicated she'd be discussing this with other lieutenant governors and the Governor General herself at an annual meeting they have later that month. And the note shows that the Governor General's office did not want that to happen. It feared media coverage. It feared awkward questions to the Governor General. They provided her media lines just in case that happens. And it sounds like the office even had a word with organizers of that event to make sure things were kept as low key as possible. So this was an interesting story for me because it highlights a fundamental tension in our federal system, namely that we have an important role for the Governor General and Lieutenant Governor in signing things into legislation. And while theoretically, Lacani could have chosen not to do so or reserve it back to the Governor General for review. But in practice, basically nobody wants to see that happen, as that would likely open a whole can of constitutional worms that not many people have an appetite for right now. So the Sovereignty Act, in the end, turned out to be a little different than we first thought and changed several times since that September. And Lacani did, in fact, sign it into law without much fanfare, though the government has still yet to use that legislation.
Mm-hmm. And it's a fascinating peek behind the vice-regal curtain, to be sure. Well, it's fascinating always to talk to both of you, Lisa Johnson, Matthew Black. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
That's it for another episode of Under the Dome. Don't forget you can find all past episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome or hit that subscribe button on YouTube. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.